He was one of the most feared, capricious, and scandalous kings in all of history. A man who ordered the execution of two of his wives, broke with the Pope himself, and founded his own church simply because he was not given a male heir. Henry VIII seemed to have it all: power, wealth, women, and a kingdom at his feet. But his life ended in absolute decadence. Obese, infected, plagued, and rotting alive. Today I will tell you 15 facts you didn't know about his life, and the horrifying end suffered by the king who made England tremble. Before continuing with the topic, we invite you to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. Without further ado, let's begin. He was not born to be king. Henry VIII came into the world on June 28, 1491, at Greenwich Palace. He was the second son of King Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty, a royal house that had just taken power after decades of civil war. As the second-born, Henry was destined for a religious or diplomatic life, not for the throne. The burden of the crown rested on his older brother, Arthur, a young man prepared from childhood to rule. But tragedy altered England's destiny. Arthur died at the age of 15, leaving Henry as the unexpected heir. Overnight, the sideline prince became the center of a rising empire. His life, from then on, will be marked by the way of a crown that wasn't made for him. He married his brother's widow. Shortly after Arthur's death, the court's eyes turned to Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess and now royal widow. Henry VII did not want to return her dowry, and marriage to Henry seemed like the perfect political solution. But there was an obstacle. Divine law forbade marriage to a deceased brother's wife. To overcome this, the intervention of none other than Pope Julius II was needed, who issued a papal dispensation asserting that the previous marriage had never been consummated. Thus, in 1509, a few months after his father's death, Henry VIII ascended the throne and took Catherine as his queen consort. That marriage, built on an ecclesiastical exception, would later become the spark of a religious revolution. He was a charismatic and athletic young man. Few kings have begun their reigns with such splendor. Henry VIII, barely 18 years old, was a living image of the Renaissance ideal: tall, strong, charismatic, educated in the humanities, and passionate about sports, banquets, and music. He played several instruments, composed songs, recited poetry, and competed skillfully in jousting tournaments. Unlike the dark, cold kings of the medieval past, Henry shone like a star at court. He was a popular monarch with an almost hypnotic energy. No one could imagine that this young man full of life would end up surrounded by blood, betrayal, and madness. He was devoutly Catholic at first. Before becoming the scourge of Catholicism in England, Henry was one of its most fervent defenders. In 1521, he published a Latin treatise titled Defense of the Seven Sacraments, a direct response to the ideas of Martin Luther that were beginning to shake Europe. Pope Leo X, delighted with the work, proclaimed him Defender of the Faith, a title still held by British monarchs. The young king presented himself as a champion of the papacy, an orthodox monarch obedient to Rome. Paradoxically, it was his very devotion that fueled his spiritual and political crisis years later, when he felt betrayed by the same papal throne that had once exalted him. Desperate for a male heir, Henry VIII didn't just want an heir, he needed one. His dynasty was young and fragile, born out of conflict. Catherine of Aragon became pregnant multiple times, but all her children, except for a girl named Mary, died at birth or in infancy. The king interpreted this as a divine curse. Perhaps he thought his marriage to his brother's widow was indeed a sin, as the Bible warned. This obsession with a male heir was more than a matter of pride. It was the survival of his lineage. England needed stability, and Henry was willing to challenge everything and everyone to secure it. He fell in love with Anne Boleyn. The arrival of Anne Boleyn at court changed the course of English history. She was not the most beautiful or the most docile, but her intelligence and cunning captivated the king. Henry was enthralled by her defiant spirit and her refusal to be just a mistress, and demanded the crown. Her relationship with Henry, which began around 1525, was much more than a romance. It was a political war. The king asked Pope Clement VII to annul his marriage to Catherine, arguing it had been invalid from the start. The Pope, trapped by diplomatic pressures, refused. Henry, impatient and humiliated, made a radical decision. He would no longer ask for permission. He would take it by force. He broke with the Catholic Church. In 1534, Henry VIII broke with over 1,000 years of religious tradition in England through the Act of Supremacy. Parliament declared that the king was now the only supreme head of the Church of England. This act not only allowed him to annul his marriage to Catherine and Mary and Bullen, but also destroyed the Pope's power on his lands. England officially separated from Rome, monasteries would be looted, dissenters persecuted, and a new era of reforms, some imposed by force, would begin. Spiritual and temporal power fused under crown, and Henry stood as a new kind of king, one who answered only to himself. He married 6 times. Throughout his life, Henry VIII proved that love, desire, and politics were pieces of the same chessboard. His marital history became legendary. 6 women, 6 fates. He exiled Catherine of Aragon, executed, and Bullen. With Jane Seymour, he finally had a male heir, but she died after childbirth. He then married Anne of Cleves, a political alliance that failed due to mutual lack of attraction. He soon repudiated her. Next came Catherine Howard, a young woman who sparked his passion, but also his fury when accused of infidelity. Finally, he married Catherine Parr, who managed to survive the old king. His marriages were not fairy tales. They were battles, sacrifices, and pawns in a cruel game of power. He ordered the execution of 2 of his wives. The love of Henry VIII could turn deadly. When and Bullen did not give him the promised male heir and her political influence began to crumble, the king did not hesitate to accuse her of adultery, incest, and treason. She would be beheaded in 1536 in the Tower of London, in an act that shocked all of Europe. Years later, he repeated the pattern with Catherine Howard, a teenager who caught his attention and who, after being accused of having relationships with other men, was also sent to the scaffold. Both died by order of the same man who once loved them. Henry's crown was a throne stained with blood. He was brutal with his enemies. No one was safe from the fury of Henry VIII. His reign was marked by ruthless repression. Anyone who dared to oppose him, even on ground of conscience, paid with their life. One of the most shocking cases was that of the humanist and Chancellor Thomas More, who refused to recognize the king as supreme head of the church. He was arrested, tried for treason, and beheaded in 1535. Nobles, bishops, monks, and even former allies were executed if they posed a threat to his authority. Henry tolerated no dissent. His word was law, and his law was the sword. Hypochondria and feared disease. Henry VIII was deeply hypochondriac. He had an extreme fear of falling ill, especially with the plague, which led him to live in constant obsession over his health. He avoided contact with sick people, frequently changed residence to escape outbreaks, and surrounded himself with doctors and unusual hygiene measures of time. This anxiety over health not only shaped his daily behavior, but worsened his paranoia, making him even more distrustful and reserved. His fear of dying young turned him into a cold, calculating, and secretive man. He became obese and sickly. As the years went by, Henry VIII ceased to be the athletic and attractive young man he once was. His health deteriorated rapidly, especially after an accident in a tournament in 1536 that left him with a severely injured leg. That wound never fully healed, and open, purulent ulcers developed, causing him unbearable pain. Since he couldn't exercise, he became extremely overweight. He came to weigh more than 180 kilos and had to be transported with pulleys. The obesity caused him heart problems, gout, and possibly diabetes. He was so large that special armor and beds had to be made for him. His physical condition turned him into a moody, sedentary, and increasingly irritable man. His body exploded. When he died on January 28, 1547, Henry VIII's body was already in a terrible state. The ulcers that tormented him in life had irreversibly infected his body, and the accumulation of fluids and gases caused his corpse to decompose rapidly. He was placed in a lead coffin to contain the odor and fluids, but during the transfer to his burial place in Windsor, the coffin swelled and burst due to internal pressure. The putrid liquid spilled onto the chapel floor, creating a repugnant scene. Some witnesses even claimed that dogs licked the remains. Although this may be a legend, what is certain is that his body literally rotted and exploded, being a grotesque reflection of the physical and moral decay he had suffered. His daughter Elizabeth became one of the greatest monarchs. Despite the chaos and executions during the reign of Henry VIII, his daughter Elizabeth I, born at his marriage to Boleyn, would become one of the most admired figures in English history. She ascended the throne in 1558 and reigned for 45 years, in an era known as the Elizabethan Age. Under her leadership, England experienced cultural, naval, and political expansion. She resisted invasions such as the Spanish Armada, protected Protestantism, and supported figures like Shakespeare. She was a shrewd, educated, and charismatic queen who refused to marry and held power firmly in her hands, leaving behind her father's bloody legacy and forging a new image of a strong and stable monarchy. The life of Henry VIII was a reflection of absolute power, brilliant in its beginnings, but increasingly marked by fear, illness, and isolation. His death was as shocking as his reign, and the state of his body symbolized the physical and political decay of his final years. In spite of everything, it was his daughter Elizabeth who transformed the Tudor legacy and led England into one of its most admired eras. Thank you for staying with us until the end of the video. Give us a like and subscribe to the channel for more historical content.